I came off of meth and cocaine. And man, it's been a life changer. I mean, I love life now. Man, I tell you, I get fired up for God, man.
Sorry, guys. Let me start this morning with a Bible verse, really simple, but it's a Bible verse that has guided American thinking for generations. It's gotten away from us in recent generations. It's a Bible verse, Proverbs 14:34. Proverbs 14:34. Whoops, guys, can we throw that up there? There we go. It's coming. Interesting, different from that. Are you able to get my feedback there? You get my signal coming through? Because I should have a different one up there. There it is, thank you. Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalts a nation, sins a reproach to any people. I want to show you how that was used in generations. For example, if you go back to the founding era, Patrick Henry, this is what he said to his generation. He said, righteousness alone can exalt a nation. Reader, whoever thou art, remember this, and in thy sphere practice virtue thyself and encourage it in others. He said, this is the bottom line. We had an American Revolution, but nothing works if we don't do righteousness, and you've got to do that, and you've got to encourage everybody else to do that. 2 generations later, you have Frederick Douglass, great civil rights leader, minister. He's an AME Zion minister. This is what he said to his generation. He was very politically involved, by the way. He served in 4 different presidential administrations. He said, I have one great political idea. That idea is an old one. It's widely and generally assented to, but it nevertheless is generally trampled on, disregarded. Everybody says, oh, yeah. I said, but very few people actually do it. He says, the best expression of it I have found in the Bible, it is in substance, righteousness exalts a nation, but sins a reproach to any people. He said, this constitutes my politics. This constitutes the negative and the positive of my politics. I feel it my duty to do all in my power to infuse this idea in the public mind. Everything I'm for, everything I'm against in politics is based on Proverbs 14:34. Righteousness exalts a nation. Then 2 generations after that, you have Francis Grimke. Francis Grimke was a civil rights leader. He was actually born in the Civil War, born before the Civil War. He grew up as a slave. He watched after the Civil War how the Jim Crow got started and it was so bad and Ku Klux Klan was there. He watched the nation be torn apart in the Civil War. He watched how bad it was after the Civil War. And in the 20th century, he watched the revival of the Klan coming back. Here came the Klan again. He goes, oh my gosh, are we going to do this again? Are we going to have another split? And he said, no, we're not going to have another split. We won't split over racial issues. He says, here will be our problem. He said real simply, he said, if the time ever comes when we shall go to pieces, we won't have another civil war, it will be from inward corruption, from the disregard of right principles. It will be from leaving the principles in the Declaration of Independence, in the Golden Rule, in the 10 Commandments, and in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, it will come from losing sight of the fact that righteousness exalts a nation, but sins a reproach to any people. If we ever go to pieces as a nation, it'll be because we forgot that Bible verse. He concluded with this. He says, unless we hold firmly to the great fundamental principles of righteousness, America will be only a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. Stuff's tough, but see, that's how important that Bible verse is. So righteousness exalts a nation. You get that driven into your head. Everything you see in politics, we're coming up in an election, but there's elections that happen throughout the year as well. You have school board elections, city council elections. Everything should be driven by the thought of righteousness exalts a nation. Which candidate's going to help righteousness exalts a nation? Which policy, whatever it is. As Frederick Douglass said, that's the positive and the negative of my politics. Now, here's the question. Righteousness exalts a nation, but how do you measure the righteousness of a nation? If God's going to bless on the basis of righteousness, oppose it on the basis of unrighteousness, how do you know? I mean, what degree on this, where are we? And by the way, since Exodus 18:21 says that we're to choose out leaders over tens, fifties, hundreds, and thousands, which means local, county, state, and federal elections, how do you determine how do you measure the righteousness of a nation? Or how do you measure the righteousness of a state? Or how do you measure the righteousness of a county? Or how do you measure the righteousness of a city? Because there's righteousness that can be, you can have righteousness in a city and have an unrighteous state. You can have righteousness in a county and have an unrighteous nation. God looks at all of that. So how do you measure that? And the answer is very simple. It's by its public policies and by how they conform to God's standards. God looks at public policies and says, that's not good. I can't bless that. That's good. I can bless that. So it's by public policies, how they conform to his standards. And that's what you see with Elijah. You remember when Elijah confronted Ahab and Jezebel? He said, you guys, because of your wicked public policies, you brought a curse on the nation. And he called out three things particularly. He said, religious persecution. You've been after the Lord's prophets. You've been trying to persecute God's people. Said on top of that, eminent domain. You took Naboth's vineyard. It didn't belong to you. That was private property. You went in coercive, eminent domain. You shouldn't have done that. And by the way, you've been suborning perjury in the courts of justice. You've been corrupting the justice system. And he went through all this stuff that Ahab and Jezebel had been doing and says, this is not acceptable. Now, it's significant that within that, he said, because of that, we're not going to have rain for 3.5 years, which is saying weather's involved in this thing. Now, that's interesting. I wonder if weather is a direct result of the righteousness or unrighteousness of a nation. And certainly if you look in the Bible, and if you want to do a study on weather in the Bible, you will see how often weather is attached, good weather is attached to righteousness, bad weather is attached to unrighteousness. And so you find example after example in the scriptures, whether it's drought or flood or famine, whether it's rain or hail, excessive rain or hail or fire, there's just all these examples of that. Now, do we believe that today? Well, I don't know, but it's in the Bible. And it's an interesting thing to me that polling-wise, today more than half of Christians say that they think God does a really lousy job of handling the weather. What if the weather's dependent on what we do? What if a lot of the weather, maybe we do a really lousy job of handling the weather? Just a thought, just something to throw out. But certainly that was what we see in the Bible with accounts like Elijah and Ahab and Jezebel. So you have the righteousness that exalts a nation. Now, let me ask you a simple question. What do these major record-setting events have in common? Number one, the 10 costliest insurance events in U.S. history. Number two, 3 of the 4 largest tornado outbreaks in U.S. history. And number 3, the 2 largest terrorism events in U.S. history. What do all of those have in common? The answer is they all occurred within just days after America took a stand against Israel and told Israel she needs to give up her land. Ooh. Now, you may not believe that, but there's 3 interesting books out there that show the correlation of whenever we take a bad stand toward Israel, we seem to have a natural disaster that happens, an unusual natural disaster. Yeah, there's always bad weather. Yeah, but these are really big bad weather things. I mean, these aren't the small kind of things, these natural disasters. So just something interesting to think about. But what you find is that the Scripture, when it tells us righteousness exalts a nation, it also makes clear to us that a public policy can impact every citizen, even those who disagree with it. And I'll take you back to Elijah, Ahab, and Jezebel. You remember that 3.5 years of drought they had on the nation? Now, Elijah wasn't the only good guy in the nation. Remember, he thought he was, and after he whacked the prophets on Mount Carmel, he went off to the cave and said, God, get me out of here. I'm the only one left. God said, shut up. There's 7,000 guys that have never bowed their knee. So we've got all these good guys that are all, but you know what? Every one of them, including Elijah, went through 3.5 years of famine, 3.5 years of no rain. God happened to send a raven to take care of Elijah, but everybody in the nation, even the good guys, went through all the bad times. So what happens is a bad public policy or a good public policy will impact every single citizen in the nation, even if you disagree with that policy. Now, why is that the case? This is something I learned in reading American history records back at the time of the Constitutional Convention, of all places. I would never have thought that I would have got a massive Bible lesson out of there, but I was shocked at the fact that how often I got Bible lessons out of history, because so many of those in history thought biblically and actually tried to do what the Bible said. And a great example of this was one of the 55 guys who helped write the Constitution is a guy named George Mason. George Mason, in talking about what they were doing at the convention and talking about what was going on in the nation, he pointed out something that was very profound. This is what he said. He says, as nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, so they must be in this. He said, by an inevitable chain of causes and effects, providence punishes national sins by national calamities. Now you see, you and I know that at some point we will stand before God and answer for everything we do. We know out of Hebrews 4 that we'll answer to God for everything we've done. We know out of 1 Corinthians 4 we'll answer to God for what we've thought. And we know Jesus told us in Matthew 12 that every idle word you've said, you'll give account of in the day of judgment. We'll answer for all of that. That'll be at some point in the future. Nations don't have a future. When the Soviet Union is gone, it's gone. God is not going to resurrect the Soviet Union 10,000 years from now and say, why did you guys do this? So the only time that a nation has as an opportunity to be rewarded or punished for its policies is while it exists right there. There's a lot of nations in history that no longer exist and never will come back. They have to be judged during their lifetime. And see, this is the way a nation is. This is the way a political entity is. The policies they make right then, that's why weather is often an indicator of bad policies throughout the Bible. The policies they make right then have to be judged right then. We taught this from the pulpit because the Bible makes it so clear. This man, the Reverend Chandler Robbins, this is what he said in the founding era. He said the supreme governor of the world rewards or punishes nations and civil communities only in this life. Political bodies are but the creatures of time. They only exist right now. He said they have no existence as such, but in the present state. Consequently, they're incapable of rewards or punishments in a future state. Again, God's not going to resurrect them. He says the divine being therefore manifests the purity of his nature towards such societies by rewarding or punishing them here according to their public conduct. So the difference is that right now, righteousness exalts a nation right now, or wickedness takes a nation down right now. Any nation in the world, God's no respecter of persons, he's no respecter of nations. This is the standard he will use in every single nation everywhere. It's just that America had been very conscious of this policy throughout, and again, that's why Frederick Douglass said, all of my politics is based on this. Everything I'm for, everything I'm against is based on Proverbs 14:34. It's my understanding that righteousness exalts a nation, and if we're going to do well, it's because only that. And that's why you get a generation later as the Ku Klux Klan's coming back. He says, no, we won't go to pieces unless we ignore righteousness exalts a nation. So that's the understanding we've always had, and quite literally, that's what you see in the Bible as well. And that's why I use that story of Elijah with Ahab and Jezebel, because that's probably the most recognizable, although there are many, many, many other stories, and I'll give you some of those a little bit later. So having said that, righteousness exalts a nation, sins or reproach to any people. How do you get righteous policies enacted? Because you have political processes that we have to go through here. We have constitutional process. We have things that have to go through the House and the Senate and the President. You've got all the stuff that city council's got to go through zoning boards, and it comes to city council and the mayor. Everything's got a process to work. How do you get righteous policies enacted? And the Bible tells us very simply, easiest way to get righteous policies enacted is Proverbs 29:2, which says, when the righteous rule, the people rejoice, and when the wicked rule, the people groan. You get the right kind of people in office, you're more likely to get the right kind of principles. You get the wrong kind of, you get King David in office, you're likely to get pretty good principles. If you get King Manasseh in office, you're likely to get really bad principles. Pretty simple stuff. Doesn't matter how good your rules and laws are, you'll have good leaders or bad leaders, and that generally indicates the way things go. Now, there are exceptions to that for sure, and we're going to look at some of those exceptions later, but that's the general rule to follow. And this is something that we understood back at the beginning of our nation. Literally, when we took and we were forming our very first governments, because for all these 2 centuries, century and a half, we've been a British colony, essentially. We've been under the British crown, and all of our 13 nations, we call them colonies, but they thought of themselves more as independent nations. All of those 13 nations were under British rule. But what happened when the American Revolution occurred, and particularly when we signed the Declaration of Independence and says we're now independent nations, we're going to be one nation and we're all independent of Great Britain, we wiped out civil government. The Bible makes it very clear you're not to be without civil government. Romans 13 is very clear on that, and they understood that. And so having removed the British government, they're not to be without government, because to be without government is anarchy. That's Judges 17:21. Really bad position to be in. It's kind of close to where America has become in the last few years. We're getting close to that Judges 17:21, where that every man did that which was right in his own eyes. We now have 330 million definitions of what's right and wrong. We don't believe in absolute truths anymore as a nation. Right now, 2 out of 3 Christians say that there are no absolute moral truths, and 8 out of 10 Americans say there are no absolute moral truths. If there's no absolute moral truths, then we're going to do that which is right in our own eyes, and we're back into anarchy, and that's a terrible place to be. So back to the American founding, they knew they're not to be without government, so they started creating governments, which is why those who signed the Declaration that separated us from Great Britain, they're often the ones who went back and said, we got to get a new government started. So, for example, if you look in the state of New Jersey, John Witherspoon, signer of the Declaration, goes back to help create the 1776 Constitution of New Jersey. And then if you look at a state like Maryland, well, it was Charles Carroll of Carrollton who goes back and helps create the 1776 Constitution of Maryland, first Constitution for the state of Maryland. And it was that way throughout. And let me show you some of what was in those constitutions. For example, let me take you to the state of Delaware. Let's look at Delaware for just a moment. Now, Delaware, the Constitution of Delaware was framed by several of these guys, including Thomas McKean. You see over here George Reed, and beside him you see John Dickinson. These are the guys that went back and framed that original 1776 Constitution of Delaware. Look what's in the original Constitution of Delaware. Delaware Constitution says, every person who shall be chosen a member of either House or Senate, must say, I do profess faith in God the Father and in the Lord Jesus Christ, his only Son, and in the Holy Ghost, one God and blessed forevermore. And I do acknowledge the Holy Scriptures, the Old and New Testament, to be given by divine inspiration. Now, I will point out, that's not even the belief in most Bible schools today. But that used to be the belief in politics. Now, why would they put that in their Constitution? Because they want righteous leaders. When the righteous rule, the people rejoice, and when the wicked rule, the people groan. It does not take a hearing aid to hear all the groaning going on across the nation right now at all levels. Why is there so much griping about government going on? When the righteous rule, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. Real simple. And see, this is why the Practical Government School exists, is because of these Bible verses that most people ignore today. It is one of those 7 mountains that we've given away. We used to have it. I mean, clearly, Christians used to be involved in politics. We've given that mountain away, and it's not working too good now, and that's why you hear all the groaning. Let's go to some other states. Let's take, for example, the state of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Constitution is written by a number of those who signed the Declaration of Independence. You have, for example, Robert Treat Paine. You also have Sam Adams. You have John Adams. You have John Hancock. All these guys went back and helped create the original Constitution of Massachusetts. And when you look at that original Constitution of Massachusetts, this is what that Constitution says. Any person chosen governor or lieutenant governor, counselor, senator, or representative must say, I do declare that I believe the Christian religion and have a firm persuasion of its truth. Same principle. Let's go to a different one. Let's take, for example, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, the Constitution of Pennsylvania was written by Ben Franklin, one of our least religious founding fathers, and this is what he put in the Constitution of Pennsylvania, 1776. Back up here. There we go. He says, and each member of the legislature shall say, I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good, the punisher of the wicked, and I acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments to be given by divine inspiration. Now, if that's your least religious founding father, that tells you about the other founding fathers, because that least religious founding father, that's so much further than where most Christians today are and what they believe. So when people tell you, well, he's one of the least religious, well, that is true, but that means he's a whole lot higher than probably where the person who's making that comment is probably well above them. So, you know, it's a comparative thing, but nonetheless, the theme is the same. They understood. If you want good government, you got to have God-fearing people in government. Let's go to another one. Let's take, for example, North Carolina. North Carolina says this, no person who shall deny the being of God or the truth of the Christian religion or the divine authority, either of the Old or New Testaments, shall be capable of holding any office or place of trust or profit in the civil department of this state. Now, I would say something's happened since those days, but then again, we don't teach American history anymore. Did any of you guys learn this in school? I wonder why. It's American history. Why didn't you learn American history in American history class? Because you see, history becomes a tool to change politics. If you change the way you present your history, you will change the view you have of your country and what's expected. See, that's why history is so significant. That's why the Bible tells us so often to recall the former days, to remember the former times. That's the expectation we were built on, and guess what? We became the greatest nation in the world at that point in time. We're having some slippage right now. I wonder why that's happening, because we've lost sight of these fundamental principles. So this is the way that we understood some things back then. Now, let me take from that and let's go just to the overall understanding. When the righteous rule, the people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan. That's what you just saw in those state constitutions that we had there. And how do the righteous rule? We have to put them in. The righteous nor the wicked, neither one get in office without us putting them there. That's the only way they get there. So it's our choice. If we don't think biblically, we will put whoever we want in office. And that's been a problem with Christians, by the way, is Christians, in the last several elections, 45% of evangelical Christians say that when it comes time to vote, their pocketbook is more important than morality. That's not what God blesses. If you recall in Matthew 6, the disciples were all together and they were all concerned about where they're going to get their food and where they're going to get the clothes and now what are we going to do for shelter? And they went through all that and Jesus said, guys, look at the lilies, look at the birds, God takes care of it. He said, if you'll seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, all this other stuff will get added to you. If you want good economic blessings, go first for righteousness. You see, it's what happens when a nation pursues righteousness, the economy gets blessed and they prosper. You got a lot of prosperity in that nation. But when you start trying to pursue economic prosperity, you usually sacrifice righteousness. You got things out of order. You have to go for righteousness to get the prosperity. If you go for the prosperity, you generally lose the righteousness. So even Christians are not thinking right about how to choose their leaders. We want someone that will give us jobs. We want someone that will turn the economy around. We want someone that will bring prosperity to the nation. No, we want someone who will bring righteousness to the nation, and then prosperity will come. It's real simple stuff. So now, having said that about the importance of us choosing the right kind of leaders, I want to take you into, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the next session, what we have called for several decades, it's known as a sexual revolution. Sexual revolution, in short, is aspects of sexuality that are promoted in society that are contrary to what the Word of God says. Now, I'm going to give you specifics on that and verses on that in a little bit, but right now I want to take you to one aspect of that. And that one aspect of that is what we call non-discrimination ordinances. You see NDO down at that left-hand corner, or Billings, NDO, this is Billings, Montana. NDO, non-discrimination ordinances. Now, they're also called SOGIs, so you can have an NDO, and here's one out of San Antonio. We're going to talk about San Antonio in a minute. Here's a SOGI. SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity. There's about 205 cities, last count I saw, that had passed ordinances that are called NDOs, non-discrimination ordinances, or SOGIs, sexual orientation, gender identity ordinances, and they are to protect transgender and LGBT, and it's now LGBTQ or LGBTI. They don't know what it's going to be yet. In the last couple of months, they're trying to decide what the new, it used to be 4 letters, and now it's 5 letters, and there's kind of arguing over which of the 5 it'll be, but nonetheless, it's to protect that group of people. Now, the big question I have is, why do you need those measures? You haven't shown any examples of where these people are discriminated against, so you're passing laws that don't seem to have a need. And the reason is because every one of these laws, in this culture today, when you hear the word non-discrimination, you need to know that that will be a specific attack on biblical principles. I can show you several examples in federal law. What they call a non-discrimination law is now being used to whack Christians. What they call the Employment Non-Discrimination Act is being used to whack Christian organizations. What they call the Abortion Non-Discrimination Act is being used to whack pro-life groups. Across the board today, when they say non-discrimination, that means they're going to target Christians, and that's exactly what happened here. For example, when this ordinance was passed in Houston passed this ordinance. They said, all right, now, pastors, we want to see your sermons. We have subpoenaed your sermons. We want to see if you're saying anything bad about homosexuality or homosexuals, because if you are, you're in trouble. And so with this NDO, it wasn't to protect the groups from discrimination. It was to go after the Christians who were saying God has a moral standard of right and wrong, and homosexuality is not right. And let's make, I'll get to more of that later. But nonetheless, you find the NDO now being used to attack Christian pastors. And they subpoenaed them and said, we want 16 forms of your communication. We want to see every text you've done. We want to see every email you've done, every Twitter, every Facebook, every social media, any kind, 16 different forms. We subpoenaed them all. Really? For what I say from my speech, if I hold a moral position that agrees with the Bible, I'm now subject to civil action. Yeah, in cities that have that. As a matter of fact, I mentioned San Antonio. You saw San Antonio. Let me show you what San Antonio did. They passed an NDO in San Antonio, and people thought, oh, that's good. We don't want to be against discrimination, except they just forgot to read what was in the non-discrimination ordinance, and this is what happens to most of the cities across the nation. So the non-discrimination ordinance in San Antonio said, if you publicly disagree with homosexuality or homosexual marriage, if you voice opposition to that by saying, I support traditional marriage. See, if I say I support traditional marriage, I have now, according to them, voiced my opposition to homosexuality and homosexual marriage for supporting traditional marriage. And if you do that, if you ever say, I believe marriage is between a man and a woman, there are 5 consequences that happen in that city ordinance. The first is, it's considered a Class C misdemeanor. It's a crime. It is a crime for you to say, I support traditional marriage. Number two, if you hold office, you will be dismissed from office. It's called malfeasance of office. So they will take you out of office. It doesn't matter who elected you, doesn't matter that the city elected you, doesn't matter that people in your district elected you. If you say marriage is between a man and a woman, you will be dismissed from office. You will be charged $500 a day fine when you say that, and if you continue to persist in that belief, it'll be $500 a day for a fine. You'll be prohibited from running for office ever. In other words, what I'm saying right here, it's on YouTube, it's on social media, so you've heard me say, I think marriage between a man and a woman. I can never run for office in San Antonio because of what I've said here. The sermon I preached 30 years ago, 40 years ago, something I wrote 50 years ago, keeps me from running for office in San Antonio because I believe marriage is between a man and a woman, and then I'm prohibited from doing business with the city. You see, I have this landscape business, but I can't do any business with it. I can't even apply for a contract. No, I've got a paving business, but I can't apply for a contract. I can't do any of that if I believe marriage between a man and a woman. Now, this obviously is a problem with the Constitution. Constitution gives me the right of free speech. It gives me the right to associate with whoever I want to. And if I want to associate with people who believe marriage is between a man and a woman, I've got all this constitutional protection, and it's all gone away in San Antonio. And so we say, well, let's just file a lawsuit. The Constitution's against all this. No, no. If you think the Constitution stops this, you're dead wrong. Constitution's not stopping. What do you mean? Free speech. No, let me go back to one of the guys who helped write the Constitution. This is a guy at the Constitutional Convention. His name is John Francis Mercer. In the middle of writing the Constitution of the United States, he made a statement that we would kind of all raise our eyebrows at and maybe consider a little heretical. And considering the fact that they were in the middle of writing the Constitution, it's kind of an unusual statement that he made. He said, gentlemen, he said, it's a great mistake to suppose the paper we're to propose will govern the United States. Hey guys, you understand, we are writing the Constitution, but we all know that's not what's going to govern America. What do you mean it's not? Then why are you writing it? We take an oath to uphold it when we go into public office. Yeah, but we all know that's not what governs America. He continued. He said, it's the men that the Constitution will bring into the government, the interest they have in maintaining it, that will govern them. He said, the paper will only mark out the mode and the form, but men are the substance and men must do the business. You see, we can have a great Constitution, but if we put people in office who don't believe what the Constitution says, are they going to uphold it? Absolutely not. They'll uphold what they believe. People will enact their worldview into policy. You can have a Constitution that says, I have the right of free speech, but if I got somebody in office who says, well, you can't have the right of free speech if it's about marriage, then what policy are they going to uphold? They're going to uphold their viewpoints. And that's why the Constitution only shows you how to get people in office. If we choose to put lousy people in office, we're going to get lousy policies as a result. Constitution's a great document. It doesn't work well unless you put the right kind of people with it, if that all makes sense. So going back to these non-discrimination ordinances, what you got to do is you got to get the right kind of people in office, because the Constitution deals with this, so we're back to the righteous rule, the people rejoice. So this is on us. Anything that happens in city, state, county, federal, it's on us, because we're the ones who choose the leaders. So let me show you how this works out. If you're going to choose in America, you need to be a voter. What does it take to be a voter? According to the Constitution, all you have to be is 18 years and older. So if you're 18 years and older, you can vote. Now in America, what we say is, look, we want to make sure that you only vote once and you are who you say you are, so we want you to register to vote. That's a really simple thing to do. All you have to do is sign a piece of paper. Say, I am who I am, and I want to vote. Well, so far, only 67.1% of Americans are registered to vote. So 1 out of 3 Americans say, I'm not going to have I don't want to get involved in any direction this country's headed, good or bad. I don't care where it goes. I'm just along for the ride. So 1 out of 3 Americans not even registered, and that's so simple. Doesn't mean they vote. It just means that they're eligible to be a voter at that point in time. Now, we're in a presidential election year right now, and as we move to a presidential election year, here's what happens in going to 1980. Since 1980, what happens is 54% of registered voters vote in a presidential election. But that's not 54% of Americans, that's 54% of registered voters, which means that's 54% of 67%, which means that in a presidential election, only about 36% of adults vote in a presidential election. To win the election, you only have to have half of that, which is 18%, which means since 1980, only 1 out of 5 Americans has chosen the President of the United States. That's not good stewardship. You know, we can crone all day long about what's going on. It's on, and I'm not going to say it's 4 out of 5 that didn't do it. It's 3 out of 5, because 1 out of 5 tried to vote the other direction, and 3 out of 5 didn't do anything with it. So we're looking at 60% of Americans who don't have any voice, don't use any voice in choosing the President of the United States. When you go to off-year elections, which is what we had 2 years ago, what we'll have 2 years from now, this is when we choose our governors and our senators and our congressmen, et cetera. In races like that, we only have 39% of registered people who vote. Now, 39% of 67%, that puts you down at around 26% of adults. To win, you only have to have half of that, which is 13%, which means when we choose our governors and our senators and our reps, et cetera, only 1 out of 8 Americans chooses our governors and our leaders. 1 out of 8. See, this is such an easy thing to turn around, and we all think it's an insurmountable mountain. This is so big, we'll never get America turned in the right direction. It's such an easy thing to do if we, the people, take charge of it. Now, having said that, you've seen what happens with presidential and off-year elections, the percentage of people who actually choose the winner. It's different when you go to local elections. And let me take you, for example, to that is a map of San Antonio. That's the city council districts there. They're the ones in each of those districts who voted to implement this policy that if you support traditional marriage, we're going to fine you and we're never going to let you run for office. And so all you got to do is look in those districts and see who the leaders are. And what you find, not just in San Antonio, but in nearly every city across the United States, in city elections, only 6% of folks vote. Now, that's 6% of registered voters, which means only 4% of the adults in a city vote in an election. And it only takes half of that to win. So generally, and San Antonio is one of the 10 largest cities in the United States, and the mayor got elected with 2% of adults voting in San Antonio. And that's the way it is for nearly every major city in the United States. You're looking at a margin like that. Well, we said, you know, we need to get different leadership here, and so we found a really godly woman to run for office who supports marriage, who won't implement that policy, who she's good all the way across the board. We need her to run. Now, it's a difficulty because San Antonio is a 70% Hispanic city, and she's African American, and San Antonio is only 6% African American city. So to get her to win in a 70% Hispanic city is going to be a tough thing to do, unless you get the churches involved. And so what we did was we got 2,100 churches involved in that election. And instead of the normal turnout of 4% in the election, we had a turnout of 15% in the election. Guess who won the election? Really easy thing to do. It was not that hard a thing to do. And in the city of Houston, where they had that policy, said, we're going to subpoena the pastor, said, got to do that different. So we did an initiative that made that policy go on the ballot so the voters could vote on it. And again, instead of 4%, which is actually just 2%, instead of 4% turnout, we actually had 15% turnout in Houston because we got 5,000 churches involved in Houston. And by 60 to 40 majority, they took that policy off the books. It has gone out of the city of Houston. But it's... Do you think there's a greater chance that God can bless Houston when they don't have a policy on the books that takes an exact stand against God? Sure. And so that's why policies do matter, and that's why they are important. So that's what happened in San Antonio. Now, I want to take you to a couple of other elections as well. As this transgender stuff is going across the nation, and we can't figure out what gender we are, but we got to protect everybody because they don't really know what gender they are. We have this deal that schools are now saying, hey, let's not do 2 bathrooms anymore. Let's do 1 bathroom, 1 locker room. Let's get everybody together in just one place. And there was a lady in Bentonville, Arkansas, who said, she's a Christian lady, she said, no, we're not putting boys and girls in the same locker room. And so she said, I'm running for the school board because Bentonville said, we're going to do that. One locker room, 1 bathroom. And when Bentonville said that, she said, not in this town. No, I'm going to do everything I can to stop that. So now Bentonville, you need to understand, is a town of 40,000 people. There's 40,000 in Bentonville. So 40,000 people in Bentonville. She's running for Bentonville is the home of Walmart, so that's where all those business centers are and all those folks are. And she's running for school board there, and it turned out she got elected. In a town of 40,000 people, do you know how many total votes she received in the election? Total votes cast. And she won. She had a total of 35 votes cast in that election. That means you and your Sunday school class can elect the city council. I mean, it's pretty easy stuff. She got elected with a total of 35 votes. I want to take you to Riceville, Iowa, because Riceville, Iowa, the school board election there, you know, same kind of stuff going on. School board election, and a guy says, I'm going to run, and he ran, and it turned out on election day he got really busy. He ended up not voting for himself, and it ended up, not only did he lose the election by 1 vote, but not a single person voted in that election. Had he voted for himself, he would be in charge of the whole thing. Had he voted for himself. See, it's so much easier than we think it is, but we've got this mentality, oh, I'll never climb that mountain. Well, you never know until you try. Caleb says, I'm 86. Give me the biggest mountain you got with the biggest giants you got. I'm looking forward to it. That's the mentality you got to have. And when you do it, you find, you know, it's a lot of paper lines a lot of times. Nobody votes in the election. I could have been president of the school board if I'd voted for myself. Are you kidding? See, not every city's like that, and I'm not saying it is, but I'm just saying that happens very frequently. So here we are at a presidential election time. We're looking at presidential elections, and doing that, I want to conclude with some thoughts about the presidential elections. Now, I've got a very good friend. His name is Rabbi Daniel Lapin. He's my personal rabbi. I think every Christian needs a rabbi. He's my rabbi. He has opened the scriptures to me in such a way that has been mind-boggling. I've studied the scriptures most of my life. I think I'm fairly knowledgeable of them, and he keeps giving me these nuggets that just take me so much deeper. For example, Rabbi Lapin said, you do realize that when God spoke to man, he spoke to Adam. That's the first man he spoke to. And when God spoke to Adam, he chose to speak to Adam in Hebrew. That's the language God chose. Now, he could have chosen Russian, Italian, French, Latin, Greek, English. He spoke in Hebrew. That was the language God chose. And he says, therefore, that is the language of God, which means that everything in Hebrew means something to God, because he spoke, came out of his mouth, which is why it's interesting. You look at Rachel and Leah when they're having the kids, and the 12 tribes that come from that. When Rachel has her child, she looks at him and says, behold, a son. You know what his name was? His name was, behold, a son. Now, the word for that is Reuben. And so that's what Reuben means, is behold a son. And then when Leah had her son, she says, the son of my right hand. You know what his name was? The son of my right hand. In Hebrew, that's Benjamin. You see, in Hebrew, every word means something. And so they named the kids on whatever character trait or whatever was going on, whatever it was at the time. So everything in Hebrew means something. Hebrew language is very significant. And Rabbi told me, he says, which therefore means that what you can't say in Hebrew is also significant because it shows the mind of God. He said, for example, did you know that in Hebrew you cannot say the word coincidence? That word does not exist in Hebrew. Why? Never crossed God. What, you think God said, oh man, I didn't see that coming. Wow, that's great. You know, nothing's a coincidence. There is no coincidence in the thinking of God. It's ordained, it's planned, it's laid out. Therefore, you can't even say the word coincidence in Hebrew, because it never crossed his mind that something might be, oh, that's lucky, oh, that's accidental. No, it didn't cross his mind. So that's deep. You know, I said, so what else can you not say in Hebrew? He said, well, you can't say retirement in Hebrew. It doesn't exist. That makes sense. There's never a time when God didn't want us to be productive. He didn't put us here to not be productive. You know, the one example in the New Testament, the one guy said, I've now laid it all up. I'm going to take ease. I'm going to retire and enjoy myself. And the Bible says, you fool, this night your soul's required of you. Retirement didn't turn out too well for him. So I said, what else can't you say in Hebrew? He said, well, you can't say the word fair in Hebrew. Yeah, that makes sense. What happened to Job wasn't fair, but it wasn't about what was fair. You see, one of the things I've learned is God is not nearly so concerned with what happens to you as with how you respond to what happens to you. Because see, Job, everybody could say, that's not fair. Job lost it all. But God's back here saying, Satan, you watch. He's going to respond exactly. I guarantee you he's going to do the right thing. See, it wasn't about what was fair. It was about how Job responded to things. And as a result of responding right, he got twice as much of everything. See, what happened to Jesus wasn't fair, but aren't we glad that happened anyway? You see, what happened to Joseph wasn't fair, but it saved the nation of Israel. You can't say the word fair in Hebrew because it doesn't exist. It doesn't cross God's mind that something's fair or not fair. It's what does it do to help achieve his ends. I said, what else can't you say in Hebrew? He said, well, you can't say the word rights in Hebrew. The word rights is not, we talk about, I got a right of free speech, got a right of association, got a right to vote. He said, you can't say the word. He said, what you can say in Hebrew is responsibilities. You don't have rights, you have responsibilities. Now, I'm going to take that, I'm going to turn it right back around and say, that applies to voting. So if you think you have a right to vote, let me tell you right now, you do not have a right to vote. You have a responsibility to vote. It's not an option. See, if you have a right to vote, then the vote belongs to you. And I can do what I want to with my... No, the vote doesn't belong to you. This is Matthew 25, Luke 19. The master called them all together. He said, here, I'm giving you a trust. You take care of this till I get back. Luke 19, 13, he says, you occupy till I come. You do business with it. I've given you your government. I've given you a vote. You take care of that till I get back. He gets back. He says, what'd you do with that vote I gave you? And the guy said, I didn't do anything with it. Remember, he's the guy who got in trouble. The guy who'd been given a vote and did nothing with it is the guy who got thumped by God for not doing it. He gave us a vote. What are you going to do? I don't like anybody running. I think neither one of them are good. I'm not going to vote for either. No, that's not your option. You've got to vote. You have to invest it in something. You don't have the right to vote. You have the responsibility to vote. Now, when you do that, how do you know what to vote on? This is where Christians really get goofed up on this thing. So let me see if I can make it easy for you. We go back to Proverbs 14:34. We vote on righteousness, exalts a nation, sends a reproach to any people. How do you get righteousness in a nation? Well, if you go to the book of Isaiah, Isaiah is the prophet, and God has raised him up to bring the nation back to himself. And at that point in time, the nation needs to be brought back to God. So God gives Isaiah this promise, I'm going to get the nation back to me, and here's how I'm going to do it. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 26, this is what God promises Isaiah. I'll give you judges at the beginning and lawyers as the first, and then what? If I get the right kind of judges, the right kind of attorneys, then what? Then you'll be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city. If you get the right kind of judges, you can be a righteous place. If you'll recognize nearly everything we fight in the culture war today came out of the courthouses, not out of the legislatures. Whether it be Roe v. Wade, whether it be the definition of marriage, whether it be transgender, whether it be the rights of conscience, all of that comes from judges, not from legislatures. So if you want righteousness to exalt a nation, you better get the right kind of judges in there, which means the first thing I'm going to ask is, all right, what kind of judges am I going to get from this person? Am I going to get pro-life judges or pro-abortion judges? Will I get judges who protect the definition of marriage, or judges who think marriage can be between 3 cows and a man, or whatever it is? You know, what's it going to be? That's the first thing I'll vote on, is what kind of judges will I get. The second thing I'll vote on goes back to Genesis 12, verse 3. At that point in time, God made Abram this promise. He says, Abram, I'll make you into a great nation. Whoever blesses be blessed, whoever curses be cursed. That's God's covenant that he made, and that's the covenant with Israel. That's the nation he made them into. And so how long does God keep that covenant? Well, he tells us in Psalm 105, I keep my covenant for 1,000 generations. I will point out we're only 200 generations since Abraham, so we got a long time left in this covenant. It's still got it's not expired by any way, shape, fashion, form. God said, look, I don't lie like men do. I'm not a man that I should lie. If I said I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. So that means the covenant with Israel is still very much in effect, which means we got to choose a leader who's going to do the right thing toward Israel, because the way we treat Israel is the way God's going to treat us. You know, you saw those 3 books earlier. And by the way, political people are smart enough now to say the right thing about Israel, because the American people really support Israel. So the next question you ask is, no, I don't care what you say about supporting Israel. Here's the better question. Do you help Israel's enemies? Because if you help Israel's enemies, God's not going to bless you. If you help the Palestinians who are trying to destroy Israel, that's a real problem. If you help Iran, who's trying to destroy Israel, if I'm helping Israel's enemies, then I'm really not helping Israel. So that's a question you have to ask. There's interesting things beyond that. If you remember the story, we talked a little earlier about Jacob and his sons, and he blesses the sons, and you know, it ends up that Joseph gets to be the guy who saves the family, so they all move to Egypt. And when they get to Egypt, it works out pretty good for a while, but then they end up being slaves for 400 years, and God finally says, I've had enough of that, no more slavery. And so God raises up a deliverer and sends a deliverer, and so through the 10 plagues that we know that happen, God delivers the nation, and God gets them out the Red Sea, and then not only does he deliver the nation, he destroys the enemy, and then by a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire, he leads them through the wilderness, and he finally gets them out to that mountain. And he says, okay, nobody's chasing you. You've got nowhere to go. I've got your full attention. So let's build a nation. I'm going to tell you how to build a nation. And so at that point in time, he gives them 613 laws. Those 613 laws encompass everything a nation ever will need to know to build it. I mean, you choose the issue, it's there, because God built a nation. That's why we say the Bible applies to everything that goes on in civil life. God built a nation. He knows what it needs. But it's interesting that out of that, God also said, by the way, here's my 613 laws, but you need to know that I got some that are more important than others. I have priorities on these things. Matter of fact, here's my top 10. Here's the 10 things I think are most important. We call those things the 10 Commandments. And in those 10 Commandments, and by the way, in Exodus 23, God says, this is the tenor of my laws. These 10 things right here, this is the heart, the soul, the guts of my laws. And at that point in time, you look at what the 10 are. There's 3 of them that are up in the selection. The first one, I'm the Lord thy God, which is public religious acknowledgments, which includes the rights of religious conscience. Does a baker have a right to say no? I don't want to participate in a homosexual wedding. Does a photographer have that right? Does a nurse have the right to say, no, I don't want to be involved in an abortion? Does a doctor have a right to say, no, I don't want to give drugs that will end life. I don't want to be involved in physician-assisted suicide. Do you have that right? Well, right now, most of the answer to that is no, you don't have that right. So that's a big issue. Where are candidates on that right? Will you protect the rights of Christians to live out their faith in public, or are you going to try to continue to penalize them for that? That's one issue to deal with. Another issue to deal with is the issue where God says, thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, what's that mean? That means God wants sexuality confined to a man and a woman in a lifelong relationship. Any sex outside of that relationship is wrong. Sex before marriage, sex outside of marriage, adultery, or homosexual sex. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's not sex between a man and a woman in a lifelong union, it's wrong. So figure out who's going to protect marriage. Who understands the definition of marriage? Marriage between a man and a woman, that's the person you want in office. And the final one I'll give you, it says, thou shalt not kill. Now we know that in Hebrew means you don't shed innocent blood. Scripture's very clear. Every time you shed innocent blood, God brings a curse on the nation. Shedding innocent blood is a bad thing. I think that deals with abortion, doesn't it? So see, that makes the top 10. So when you go to vote, and you will go to vote, you have a responsibility to vote. When you go vote, there are 5 things you look at right up top. You say, okay, where's the candidate on abortion? Where are they on marriage protection, sexuality? Where are they on religious acknowledgments and conscience? Where are they on judges? Where are they on Israel? But my issue is economics. Great, that can be issue number 6 on the list, but it can't be one of the top 5. Those are the top 5. Well, my issue is the environment. Great, that's number 6. After you get through the top 5, then you can look at where they are on environment. But you got to do the top 5 first. See, that's the priority that God gives. And by the way, let me point out biblically, just because you have a great leader doesn't mean you get a great policy. David was a good leader, but he numbered the troops. God brought a curse on the nation, wiped out 70,000 people. Hezekiah is a good leader, but he revealed all the military secrets to the Assyrians, and God brought a curse on the nation. It's not how good your leader is, it's how good your policies are. And that's why you look at issues like this to say, I want the right policies in place. God blesses policies, not leaders. God blesses righteous leaders. I'm not saying that. But blessing the nation is not on the basis of the leader. It's on the basis of the policy that leader enacts, if that makes sense. So you're going to vote, and when you do vote, you need to keep in mind Proverbs 14:34, righteousness exalts a nation, sins a reproach to any people. Richard Harris from Practical Government School. Richard, come on, you close this out. Sorry, I ran a couple minutes into your time. Sorry, bro.
Thank you, David. In October of 2012, I spoke out very vocally about the election and what we had in Obama and Romney. Well, it garnered quite a bit of attention, local media, and after the service that day, someone said, you might ought to watch the local news broadcast. You're the top story. The top story said, local church breaks law, preaches politics. And I'm a believer, if the shoe fits, I need to wear it. But I got up the next Sunday to say, first off, I did not break the law, and secondly, I did not preach politics. However, I touched arenas of politics because of the moral issues that I addressed. Don't be one of those that is intimidated into silence. Get back to the Word of God and let your voice be heard. We are going to raise up an army of people that know the foundations of this nation in all various areas, from elected office to those that just get involved in a general vote. And so I want to invite everybody, get enrolled in Charis Bible College in our 3rd year Practical Government School.